podcast for developers by developers, where we discuss technology and trends in industry. I'm your host, Tony Montkolsmine. Last time we talked to Raul about some of the hackathons he's attending in the US, including CalHacks, LA Hacks, and Hackalytics. Today, we are excited to announce the second edition of the Intel Liftoff Hackathon for African AI Startups. We have a two-part episode today. First, we will talk to Dr. Bienvenu Soglo, who is the Director of Government Affairs Africa and International Government Affairs CTO Liaison for Intel, about the different challenges facing startups in Africa. The second part of the podcast will be a discussion where we talk to participants from the Intel Liftoff Hackathon for African AI Startups from last year to hear firsthand their experience from the hackathon. Welcome, Dr. Bienvenu, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very, very much for having me.
Bienvenu, can you tell us a little bit about the Intel Liftoff Hackathon for African AI Startups?
This second edition of the Intel Liftoff Hackathon for African AI Startup, the theme is Hack and Connect. It's a virtual event taking place from the 27th to 31st of May 2024, and it is designed to bring together aspiring tech entrepreneurs, software developers, and AI enthusiasts to collaborate, innovate, and create solutions to concrete African challenges. And for this second edition, we're collaborating with 9 partners, which are Models Africa, University Mohammed VI Polytechnic, UMCSP, but we also have UMCSP Ventures, TUT Hub of Artificial Intelligence Institute of South Africa, Prosper Africa, Fast Accelerator, IZ Hub, Open Startup International, and Innovate Technology Hub. I want to mention that because the idea that we have is that, okay, look, let's see what we can bring to the table as Intel. And we're looking at bringing our technical and engineering know-how to the table, especially in AI, to support innovation, to support the engineering team of the African AI startup teams. But we do understand that we can't do this alone. We need the support from various stakeholders, and therefore we partner with various stakeholders for them to bring different angles so that we can help the ecosystem, the AI ecosystem on the African continent to thrive.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you think of on a day-to-day basis when you think about technology and how it affects different parts of the world?
Well, I think great question. And in fact, I would like to start by putting this a little bit in context, right? Looking at Intel Corporation, right? And what we're driving in terms of, being a company of innovation for the past 50 plus years, and whereby our engineers are creating innovation across the world in different areas, such as, for example, when you talk about creation of Wi-Fi, USB, and so on and so forth. But we've seen that every aspect of our life is becoming digital, right? The way we work, the way we live, the way we conduct business, and so on and so on and so forth. And we, looking at what is happening right now and in the future, this is going to be accelerated by what our CEO called the 5 superpowers, right? We have AI, artificial intelligence, right? We have, connectivity. We need to have connectivity everywhere. We need to look at cloud to edge infrastructure. We need to look at edge compute, right? We also need to look at sensing, right? And those are going actually, to enable innovation globally, but also on the African continent.
And with the African continent, is there a difference between how we should think about how technology is deployed versus, for instance, in North America, in Europe? Obviously, it's a different location, different types of infrastructure. Are there different concerns that we need to consider when we're looking at how we deploy our technology?
This is a great question. And I think, as you look at the African continent with a population of more than 1.4 billion, a very youth population, right? And looking at some of the challenges, for example, in terms of broadband connectivity, where, the the average broadband penetration is around 40% or so, lower than the world average, but that also represents a great opportunity, right, for the continent. And so as Intel on the African continent, we utilize our technology, global scale, and the deep understanding of the African market to support ICT innovation on the continent by helping to create African solutions to African challenges. So particularly our effort is focused on 4 key areas, which are first, we're looking at supporting African administration, and there we act as a trusted technology advisor in the African government digital transformation journey. Secondly, we're looking at expanding digital readiness, and there we're engaging with government across the continent to work together to upskill and reskill the youth for current workforce and for the job of the future. Thirdly, we engage in African countries, regional economic communities, and continental organizations and the key countries to contribute to the development of harmonized continental policy and regulatory frameworks, which are very important, right, in order to enable innovation. And fourthly, we supporting the African deep tech startup ecosystem in AI, for example, by enabling startups across the continent to drive innovation and leadership. And specifically, in fact, I want to focus on, how we actually looking at driving innovation on the continent. And in that vein, we put together what we call the Digitalized Africa Strategy Program, right? And for this program, it consists of 4 key pillars. So the first pillar, as I talked about earlier, is how we support the African startup ecosystem, right? That is one. The second pillar is what we call in the Intel Community Reach Program, where we're looking at how we can close the digital divide by connecting the unconnected, especially in underserved communities on the African continent. The third pillar is how we can work with universities and research institutions, let's say the likes of the master's students and PhD students, to do their research using deep tech or emerging technologies such as AI, 5G, and so on to tackle critical African challenges in areas of healthcare, in areas of food security, or in areas of climate change to provide concrete solutions. And the fourth pillar, it is where we're looking at building the capacity of the youth, but also of government officials on deep tech, such as 5G, such as Wi-Fi 6E, such as data cloud and edge, such as data protection and privacy, to help them to make informed policy making. Because if you don't understand the technology where you want to put the policy together on, then it becomes very challenging. And I'll focus specifically on the first pillar, on where we're looking at supporting the African deep tech startup ecosystem. In fact, we conducted 2 studies. And the reason why we did that is that we wanted to understand what is the state of play on the African continent as far as deep tech is concerned. And that's why we conducted a first study with AfriLabs and Brighter Bridges, where we were evaluating the African deep tech startup ecosystem. And of course, we're defining what are the deep tech clusters. We have 7 tech clusters, among which we have, AI, machine learning, computer vision. We have autonomous and robotics. We have data cloud and edge. We have data protection, data protection and privacy, and so on. And from that study, we realized that actually 60% of the 245, AI startups that deep tech startups that we identify are actually employing AI, machine learning, and computer vision. Right. That is from the first study. And from the second study, in fact, the reason why we conducted the second study is because from the first study, we realized that from the 245 deep tech startups that we identified, none of them actually has a connection with universities, which is a little bit different from what we see from the global north, let's say from Europe or in the US. And therefore, we said, okay, let's see what is happening in the university research institution on the African continent. And that's where we conducted the second study, which was evaluating the African deep tech spin-off ecosystem from the lab to the market. And that study we conducted in collaboration with Wits University in South Africa, but also with Simono Home, which is a hub here. And there we realized that actually biotechnology is the most used, followed by data cloud and edge, but also we still have AI, machine learning, and computer vision as well. And so we then combine the two studies, right? And then from the two studies, we identify where are the gaps and then where intervention are needed. And that's from there where we identify 6 key focus areas, which are number one, the need for digital deep tech skills development program, whereby we need to build the capacity of whether it is the deep tech startups, for example, the AI startup, whether it's the deep tech hubs, the AI hubs, whether it is the AI developers, whether it's the VCs that actually need to do investment in the deep tech sector or in the AI sector for them to understand better. The second area which we identify, and by, of course, during that process of doing the study, we engage with the stakeholders at large, right? The AI startups, the hubs, the VCs. What we hear from the AI startups is like, well, we need access to R&D resources, right? And so there specifically they say, well, they need access to cloud credits, right? They need access to, platform where they can validate the prototype to see if they are going into the right direction. They need access to data, right? Well-labeled data, the quality of the data. So that's the second area. The third area is about funding, right? Financial assets, right? The need for patient capital, because most of the investors, they said, okay, return on investment to invest in deep tech is too long, and therefore there's the need to have access to patient capital, but also the need for public-private partnership, as well as the need for financial support from donors organization in order to catalyze, right, the development of deep tech, especially AI on the African continent. That is the third area. The fourth area, we also need government support, whereby you need, to have policy frameworks that need to facilitate R&D development, right? Policy frameworks that need to help in order, for example, to have policies around IPs and so on, right? Policy areas where you provide, for example, there's some scholarship and so on, right? To develop the sector. Number 5, it is important to have collaboration between university research institutions and companies, right? Industrial companies as well, right? Whereby you have intervention from the companies to help, for example, those universities to put in place technology transfer offices, which are important, right, in order to create spin-offs, right, to support researchers in terms of how to protect the IPs and so on, but how those IPs actually could be used to create those startups. And finally, the go-to-market, where there's a need to kind of look at what are some of the forums event for the different stakeholders to come together to engage and discuss.
So it sounds like there's a couple different infrastructure problems, which is it sounds like how does government and I want to say research, universities, all of these things, how do they interoperate? It sounds like they're still trying to figure that out and get something normalized, which is a challenge to innovation, because without these types of guarantees, it's hard to innovate knowing that your IP is protected, that you can move in a direction and get support from your government, which I think are challenges that people in other countries don't necessarily see or other continents may not see. So that's really interesting, and I'd like to dive into that. But you also mentioned 5G. You mentioned 5G multiple times, and you mentioned earlier that Wi-Fi penetration is only 40%. With that Wi-Fi penetration being 40%, because this is a developer podcast, I want to keep it a little technical. Is there a challenge there about how you develop your solutions, do you think? Because you mentioned cloud, etc. But in the US, if I wanted to deploy something, I deploy it and I expect it'll just work in the cloud. I can do that.
Yeah.
Is that different in Africa because of the infrastructure differences?
Well, yeah, I think for the data provided, I was talking about broadband
Right.
penetration, which encompasses both, whether it's 3G, 4G, 5G, Wi-Fi, 4, 5, 6, or fiber,
Sure.
or any other means of connectivity. That is was roughly and then we talk about broadband connection penetration, right? Which might actually gives you a different number if you talk about the unique broadband penetration. So that's where the 40% is. But yes, because of that challenge, and of course, it is not even across because Africa is a continent, right? You have 54 countries, right? And therefore, you have different level of development, economic development, and therefore you have countries whereby the broadband penetration is higher. For example, we talk about Mauritius, South Africa, Kenya, and Rwanda and other countries where the broadband penetration is higher, but other countries where the broadband penetration is not that high. Having said that, yes, it's true that this represents an opportunity in terms of how do we, speed up the deployment of broadband infrastructure on the continent in order to close that gap. And in fact, there was a World Bank study that indicated that, in order to have universal broadband access on the African continent between 2021 and 2030, so over the next 10 years, an investment of around 100 billion US dollars is required. Right. So there is a need for an investment there. But also, at the same time, there are also some policy conversations, some work ongoing on the continent. For example, work we have done with Smart Africa, which is a continental organization to put together what we call a Smart Broadband 2025, looking at increasing the broadband penetration to 51%. So 50% increase compared to the broadband penetration of 2019, which was roughly around 37%. So, and therefore, there are a number of strategies put in place in order to foster that. So those are some work that are ongoing. But to your point, it is true that, because of those challenges, some of the solutions that need to be in place need to be agile, in essence, right? Some of the solutions that are put in place need to cater for those realities on the ground. And therefore, it's both ways. It's not because we have those challenges that innovation can take place. Innovation can still take place as we're catching up, to improve the broadband penetration. And as we're talking about that, the effort from Intel talking about AIPC, for example, right, comes in handy, whereby you have the capability to run, right, the optimization of your AI model and so on your computer, right, on site, and then you just go to the cloud once maybe you need some information from time to time. That could potentially be, create some opportunities, for the startups, for researchers on the continent, to have, the possibility to continue their innovation and their research.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was thinking as well, which is it's because you have a different set of, I guess, the base ground rules that you have to play with as a developer, as a researcher, as a technologist. It's going to force you to make certain trade-offs, which I think actually might, theoretically, it could put you ahead of the curve in the case of AI PC, because we go back and forth between thin client, then we had the cloud, we put stuff to the cloud, and then even in the 90s we did that, and then you brought it back and you said, no, I have really powerful systems. Then we went back to the cloud with the AWS and Azures of the world. But I think with AI PC and everybody wants their data protected, private, local, then it actually might be an opportunity, because you can still do that type of innovation without needing the cloud. And by definition, you're going to have to do those solutions without the cloud. So that actually might give a chance to get ahead, right? As the rest of the world kind of has this crutch of, I can do AI on a big backend without having to know anything about it. It's possible that actually the startups that we're going to talk to in Africa might have an advantage, because they're thinking of the problems in a completely different solution space.
Exactly. I think that's a great point. And in fact, in terms of the connectivity piece of things, we could also talk about the value that edge compute will bring to the table, right? Because when you talk about network connectivity, we said, okay, well, you have the wireless piece, but also you have the backhaul part where you need to go to the internet, and therefore there are solutions. In fact, we work with the N50 project, where Intel is actually part of the consortium globally, where we conducted a pilot in a rural area in Zambia, and there it's basically to cache actually the content that will be needed by the local community locally at the site. And then at the wireless piece, either you use 4G, 5G, or Wi-Fi to connect actually the end users that actually could have maybe education, healthcare information that are already cached. So there's also that part of the solution that will actually, provide opportunity, right, to see what would be the specific solutions that could be, available for the community on the continent.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, Africa is 54 countries, and unlike again in the United States, we think of 50 states. In the EU, we think of all the EU countries generally having some level of cooperation. You mentioned in Africa, there's different consortiums. I'm totally ignorant here, so I'm curious: is there
Yeah.
any plan to try to kind of align all of these policies outside of like independent consortiums?
Yeah, I think great question, and then it could take us very long because that is part of my government affairs job, right? And so yes, we do have a number of, in fact, continental organization. You hear me talking about, how we engage continental organizations such as the African Union, such as the African Telecommunication Union. We work a lot with the African Telecommunication Union in order to drive harmonized policy discussions around spectrum, for example. Because for you to deploy 5G or Wi-Fi 6, you need access to spectrum. And then harmonization is key to take advantage of economies of scale, right? And therefore, having harmonized policies not only on the continent, but also globally, it is very important. And therefore, we work with the African Telecommunication Union, for example, to drive those harmonized policy discussions. And then, just on that, apart from the African Telecommunication Union, we also work with regional economic communities like ECOWAS, right, where you have, a number of countries that harmonize the policies and economic discussions in that bloc. You have the East African community, you have Southern African community, you have Central African communities, and then the Northern countries, whereby that's helping harmonizing some of the policy discussions that are there. Now, I mentioned also Smart Africa, which is an organization of the African Union, both African Telecommunication Union and African and Smart Africa are sister organization of the African Union. There, it's a Pan-African organization, membership driven. 36, I believe 39 now, member states, and they are specific project driven. So we have conducted a lot of work in terms of policy. I was talking about Smart Broadband 2025. That's the work we did with them, right, to try and provide a harmonized, viewpoint on how we're looking at, supporting the increase of broadband penetration on the continent. We also work with them to develop in 2021 a Pan-African AI blueprint, right, whereby we're looking at what are the key building blocks to put together a national AI policy, right? That was published in 2021. At the same time, we also need to consider some key markets that are important for our business, where we engage them in the deeper sense. For example, South Africa, where I'm based, for example, Kenya, for example, Nigeria, for example, Egypt, and some other key strategic countries with which we work with in order to kind of foster, realization of the policies in the country, but also foster harmonized policies across the sub-region and across the continent.
Wow, that sounds really amazing.
Yeah.
It sounds very complicated as well. we're engineers. We're very used to very, very small, tight problems that we can scope and solve.
Yeah. And, and that is the interesting part because I have an engineering background. I studied control engineering for 10 years in China. And then also work in the engineering field before I joined government affairs and standards discussion. So that's make it very even more interesting as we talk about challenges, what are the solutions that need to be provided. And then the reason why, as Intel on the African continent, we're looking at having identified those 6 key, focus areas to foster deep tech on the continent. What can we bring to the table as Intel? Right. And that's where, the idea of having the Intel Liftoff Hackathon for African AI Startup was born last year, where we conducted the first editions. And then this year we're having the second edition. We actually just launched the call for application.
Yeah, and so we will actually. So this is actually we're gonna making this a 2-part podcast. We're gonna actually talk to some of those startups that participated last year and hear firsthand about the challenges that they've seen creating their startup on the African continent. But in our last couple of minutes here, Bienvenu, are there any final thoughts that you have? Typically, I ask people where they hope technology is going in the next 5 years. I guess for you, it's a similar question, but where do you hope kind of, I guess, the continent of Africa and technology is going in the next 5 years?
In terms of what will kind of define, let's say, the African continent for the next coming couple of years. I will think that innovation will be at the forefront. Given the young population and all the opportunities that the African continent has, I believe that AI is going to play a critical role in helping, African countries not only to have African solutions to African challenges, but also to have African countries to amplify what we are good at, using AI to amplify what we are good at. And at the same time, I do believe that the African continent, we actually improve its digital infrastructure, its computer power, its the data and cloud infrastructure, so that let's say additional socioeconomic opportunities would be coming forward through key leading countries, but also helping other countries to actually take the bandwagon as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement take foot and facilitate intra-African trade.
Well, it sounds like a good vision and a good dream, and let's go make it happen.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Bienvenu Soglo, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, and thank you, our listeners, for joining, and tune in for part 2, which we'll probably post at the exact same time, where we talk to some of the African startups from last year.